Hello and welcome. My name is Ruva Chinyemba and I am a student of Global Economics and Management. During the course of this lecture series on sustainability marketing, I will have the opportunity to interview Professor Frank Martin Belt and Professor Ken Peaty on the topics that they'll talk about. So with me right now, I have Professor Ken Peaty, and I have the opportunity to interview him on the first lecture he gave on marketing in the 21st century. So I personally am a student of conventional marketing, and this part of sustainability marketing is something that I've particularly found intriguing. But I have so many questions on it. You talked about sustainability marketing and it being all about maintaining a balance between social, environmental, and economic factors. But we do realize that this might imply us actually slowing down the world from depleting resources. I just wanted to find out from you, do you really consider this a sustainable idea?
Well, I think it is, because we know that the current economic system is not sustainable because it's not in balance, particularly with the world's environment and the ecosystems that make up the planet. But also, I think socially it's unsustainable in terms of we don't really have enough equality in the way that the benefits and the costs from economic activity are distributed. So I think if you look at the graph, for example, that we produced and presented in episode 1, that shows that really the tremendous upsurge, not just in world population, but also in the material standard of living that the average person on Earth enjoys. And we're already at the point where we're probably about 30% over what the Earth can support continuously into the long term in terms of the natural resources that it supplies. And I think really we have to think, well, can 6, 7, before too long 9 billion people keep living and consuming and really placing demands on the planet in the same way into the future? And I think all the scientific evidence really tells us no. So we have to find a more balanced way of producing, consuming, and living in the future. Otherwise, in a way, the planet will intervene. The planet will start to impinge on our economy. It's really almost a question of thinking of the limits to what we can do, and we're really pushing against those limits. We're almost stretching the elastic of both the financial economy, the social and political economy, and the natural environmental economy. And eventually, the elastic will kind of snap back, I think, and particularly with climate change. If you look at the Stern report, the Stern report produced a lot of very compelling evidence that unless we start investing really about 1-2% of our wealth every year in terms of developing solutions to climate change problems, so more efficient energy systems, for example, then ultimately the instability caused by climate change will start to impact the economy, and it will start to impact society in ways that really will disadvantage people, particularly people in poorer countries, very considerably. So I really think a sustainability for me is it's a sooner or later kind of proposition. If we don't do it sooner because we decide to manage our way towards a more sustainable economy and society, then we're going to be forced to do it later because we crash those planetary limits that ultimately we can't negotiate with.
All right. Since I sense some kind of urgency in this whole situation, I was actually wondering, do you think that this is actually an idea we can sell sustainably amongst the poor who are fighting to eradicate poverty and who probably battle with less job opportunities and poorer conditions? So do you perhaps foresee it as something we can sell amongst these kind of people?
I think that's a very good question. And I think the notion that we need economic growth in order to tackle environmental problems or able to solve poverty, or at least deal with poverty, is a very compelling argument. And it naturally kind of sounds right. All we need is some more money and we could solve all these problems. But I think that there's really a couple of flaws in that argument. First, it rather assumes that economic growth isn't the cause of the poverty or the environmental problems. And as we saw from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment report that I referred to during lecture 1, that the evidence suggests that although we have had economic growth that has made many people around the world richer, for some groups and some places, that economic activity has actually made them poorer. It's impoverished them. And we do know that it's started to degrade environmental systems, lower the ecosystem services that we can receive from the environment. And it rather overlooks those people who live outside the formal financial economy. Literally millions and millions of people in poorer countries live very directly from the environment. So they take their food from the environment, they take their water from the environment, their shelter, and so on. And of course, those people don't show up in the economic growth figures because they're not paying any money necessarily for the life they're living very directly from the environment. And so those people will be very directly disadvantaged if we carry on with environmental degradation that reduces their ability to meet their needs directly from the environment. So we tend to have this assumption that economic growth will provide all these good things. But of course, for those people living directly from the environment, more economic growth, more environmental damage will actually, again, make it harder for them to make a living. The other thing to say is I think we tend to assume that economic growth will in some ways reach the poor. It will help poorer countries and poorer people to become less poor. Unfortunately, that's just not often the case. If we look over the last 50 years, there's been an extraordinary amount of economic growth, unprecedented levels of economic growth globally, but has it helped everybody? And frankly, no. Often what we've seen is people in the richer countries getting richer rather than the people in the poorer countries seeing their quality of life really improve. And across Africa, a lot of countries of Africa have not seen over the last 50 years a material improvement in their standards of living. Some of them have actually become poorer. And people will say, well, it's very complicated and it's to do with all sorts of political factors and climatic factors as well as economic factors. But I think there's this assumption that economic growth will somehow be the solution and that it's not really the problem. I think is one that we need to start challenging. We need to sort of step outside the box, step outside the dominant social paradigm, our way of usually thinking about the world, to say, well, can we come up with something new, a different way of doing things, which maybe produces less economic growth in the conventional sense, but actually does make us richer in terms of quality of life, in terms of the levels of prosperity, in terms of well-being, rather than just, well, how much stuff are we producing and how much stuff are we consuming and how much money is being paid for it. Because, the weird thing about economics and economic growth is we just tend to count what people spend money on, effectively. We don't tend to think about, well, who gets what benefit. So let's take an example. Let's say you've got a relative, an elderly relative who needs some care. Yeah. Now there's several ways that care could be provided. You could do it yourself. You could go and care for your relative because you love them and you want them to be happy and have a good life, etc. Or you could pay for somebody to do it, or perhaps the government might pay for somebody to do it, or a local community volunteer might decide as part of their contribution to the community they'll go and help your relative. Now in some ways, it's only if somebody gets paid for it that it counts as part of the economy and will show up in economic growth figures. But of course it doesn't really matter to your relative who goes and helps them and whether or not anybody gets paid for it. It's really the end point of the benefits that we get that's important, not how much money changes hands within the economy to make that happen. And the other thing to say is just that with economic growth, as I've mentioned later on in the lecture series, in lecture 12, I'll talk about it then, that economic growth, measures like GDP, GNP, that we tend to use for that, they're purely quantitative. They just talk about how much stuff happens, not how good or how bad it is, which is a very crazy measure in many ways. It's like playing a football match and deciding it on who kicks the ball the most, rather than some qualitative measure like who scores the most goals. So we tend to have this very, very aggregate quantitative measure of, it's how much stuff that gets done that counts. I went to an exhibition just yesterday about the average German lifestyle and what gets consumed in it. And I was caught by one display which says the average German person spends 2.5 years of their life in their car. And of that, they spend 6 months of it sitting in a traffic jam. And so if you say, well, kind of modern life is partly about spending 6 months of your life sat in a traffic jam, you think, well, is that the kind of society and economy we want to pursue? And I always think it's very frustrating to walk through a city at night and see all these empty buildings with the lights on and think, well, that's all energy being consumed, all climate change emissions going into the atmosphere, in a sense, all that money being wasted for no real benefits, just to keep the lights on in buildings where there's nobody inside. So I think if we think about the economy, not just in terms of how much stuff can we possibly do with it, but how can we maximize the good stuff and minimize the bad stuff, we might have a shrunken economy that's smaller, but one that's actually delivering more benefits to more people.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer and interesting insights you've pointed out there. And during the lecture, you talked about sustainability marketing starting from the identification of consumer needs. But I was wondering to myself, is sustainability marketing really about first fulfilling customers' needs, or really it's something that is actually dictating to customers what they should do? So I don't know, perhaps you can explain to me what you meant exactly.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's really interesting because you end up, I think, a bit of a clash maybe between marketing theory and marketing reality. Because marketing theory and the sort of marketing purists are always very keen to portray marketing really as quite a passive servant of the customer. It's like the customer is king, consumer sovereignty. We as marketers, we don't really do anything other than we serve the customer and their needs. And there's very much a belief that, for example, a marketer can't create a demand. That demand has to be within us as consumers. Either explicitly we know we want something, or even latently we don't really know we want something, but we still want it anyway if somebody just showed it to us. And I think it's an interesting question. And for many years I wondered myself about, can a marketer create demand for something? I think the evidence I found that you can, it's actually a very strange product. It's a sweet, or candy as you might call it in America. And it was one that was developed called Warhead. Okay. And when they were developing this product, this sweet is so sour, okay, if you put it in some poor child's mouth, they will naturally just spit it out because it's so sour. Okay. So as a human being, as a child, if you're sat there, this is put in your mouth, it's so sour, you spit it out because it tastes horrible. Okay. But this candy that was then marketed to children on the basis of, tough kids chew Warhead. And in fact, it had a rival called Crybaby, which is again very much the thing of, are you tough enough to chew a Crybaby? And the funny thing was these two sweets became the fastest growing confectionery item ever in the United States. So, you imagine a product so horrible, as a kind of natural human being, you would spit it out of your mouth. And yet when you're told that, if you're tough, you'll consume it, you'll go out and consume it. And I think that for me was a kind of clinching argument that really to pretend that marketers can't create demand, I think is a bit disingenuous. I think marketers, can and sometimes do create demand. I think it's important with marketing to be led by the customer to a large extent. But I think if we're going to say, will customer demand do enough? Can the customer just by themselves lead us towards more sustainable solutions, more sustainable markets, a more sustainable society and economy? I don't think that's fair. I think that's almost expecting too much for the consumer because the consumer is constrained by all sorts of things. The society we live in, the expectations people have, even down to a lot of our consumption is influenced by the environment we're in. We might decide we don't want to use our car, we want to use public transport more, but that very much depends on that public transport infrastructure being in place. Sometimes consumers don't really feel they have a choice. So I think it's almost very much a question of different parties working together to make it happen. So I think you do have to have regulation, I think. And if you look at Europe, for example, a lot of the markets where there's been the most progress, yes, you've had customer demand for change, but you've also had regulation pushing it forward as well. So in terms of things like cars and emissions, in terms of things like electrical equipment and electrical waste. You've had laws being passed to push companies along and also help consumers along the way. For example, making labelling for energy appliances mandatory so that customers can see their energy efficiency. So I think customers have a very central role, very important part to play. I quite like to think within the book we talk about sustainability marketing as part of this move towards a relationship marketing approach. So away from just a transaction marketing approach of saying, you're the customer, you want something, I've got a nice product, here it is, you hand me the money and bye for now, is the kind of, that very conventional transaction-based, almost commodity style marketing of products was very old school sort of marketing. I think the relationship marketing is much more about, okay, you're my customer, let's talk about your needs, let's think about the products and solutions we might be able to develop, and perhaps, together we can work together towards kind of more sustainable solutions. So I think if you kind of think of it not just being, can we dream up products that our customers might want, but can we work together with customers maybe to start to move towards more sustainable solutions? I think to me that's a more sophisticated and a more sort of 21st century marketing way, if you like, of approaching it. And I think if you look at a company like Unilever and the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that they've developed, really they're almost taking responsibility for their consumers' lives. They're saying, we're not just going to sell them products, we're going to look at how they live, what part our products like detergents or foods or personal care products play in people's lives, and then we'll try and work with customers to influence them to maybe use our products differently. So people using shower gels in Australia and America, for example, Unilever have campaigns to try and persuade people to switch the shower off while they're lathering themselves up, which uses the product just as efficiently, but actually saves water while you're having a shower in countries and regions where they're quite water stressed. So it's very much this idea that maybe companies and customers can start working together to develop solutions, rather than just saying, okay, well, we'll sit back and wait until the customer knows what they want and demands products from us. But I think you can see examples where customers really have driven particular markets, sometimes by market protests. If you go back to the 1980s, I mean, CFCs, when they were associated with damage to the ozone layer, the industry were very resistant to changing, and they said, oh no, if we had to drop CFCs as propellants, that would be a disaster, and jobs would be lost, and companies would go bust, and everything. But partly because pressure groups organised a really good campaign to reach consumers, generate a sort of international consumer boycott, that took hold very quickly, and consumers did rally behind that boycott, and really it changed the industry overnight, and we've very rarely seen such a sudden change in an industry, and they were forced to find alternative solutions, new propellants, new products. So I think the consumer does have the power. I mean, if customers really decided tomorrow, okay, we're only going to buy sustainable products, they could completely change the economy overnight. Expecting them to work together that coherently to do it, I think, is perhaps a little bit much. So I think it's, we have to see it, I think, as different parties playing a role, but a consumer having a very central role, really in many markets. And if marketers can work with consumers to develop more sustainable solutions, then I think we do have a chance of making progress towards it.
Okay, yeah, and lastly, you spoke about eco-footprinting. This is a concept that I personally am hearing for the first time, if I can say. And I was wondering, you said it's about determining a point where we maintain a balance between the way we spend and the way, and not overspending, so to say. And I wanted to know, is there really a definable point of where economic development is not self-defeating? Because from what I gather, say, for example, measuring the environment, it's pretty hazy to come up with those kind of measurements. So how exactly do they go about this whole concept of eco-footprinting?
Yeah, ecological footprinting is a very interesting sort of evolving science, and in fact, BRAS, the research institute I lead, has been playing a part in it. We hosted the first global ecological footprint conference for academics back in 1986. It's interesting because ecological footprinting works by trying to understand both the sort of resource inputs and the waste sort of outputs of all the different elements of our consumption, so that we can understand it in terms of a single measure. And to try and make it simple, they turn it into land, so a concept of land. So it's saying, okay, if I want to create this product, in terms of everything, the energy, the resources that go into that product, how much land would be needed to produce that? And then also, if we have to dispose of some of the waste products, again, how much land would be required to bury the waste in? And it allows us, it was originally done in terms of thinking often about countries, in terms of how much of an ecological footprint does this country have, and how much land, in a sense, does each consumer or each citizen need to maintain their lifestyles. And it gives you different measures in terms of, it's often expressed as Earth share. So, for example, the current standard of living of a typical Chinese consumer is about 1 Earth share. So, in other words, if the whole planet lived on average at the level of the typical Chinese consumer, we'd be at about a sustainable level. In Europe, it's more like we use 3 times that amount. So if the entire world lived like a typical European, we would need 3 Earths worth of resources. The way it works, ecological footprinting, is really to have databases that take all forms of product, all types of component, so different types of energy, for example, different physical materials, different metals, woods, everything really, to work out sort of how much energy, how much resource has gone into that, and how much waste would it generate. And they create these very, very complex databases. There's various available. We use one called REAP for doing ecological footprint calculations. But it means you can take any, now you can take any 2 products and say, well, which has the greater ecological footprint. So you can take a chicken sandwich, for example, and a hamburger. And if you look at it, you'll find the chicken sandwich has a lower ecological footprint than the hamburger. You could do a glass of wine and a glass of beer, and you discover that actually the wine has got a lower footprint than the beer, and so on. And what you can do is you can look at a whole economy and say, well, okay, what's the aggregate consumption of all these different types of goods and services within a whole economy, take the ecological footprint of each type of product that's being consumed, and you can turn it into an overall measure. Now, is it a perfectly accurate measure? No, I think with all these kind of aggregate measures, you're always dealing with a certain amount of there's a certain amount of vagueness around the edges. But I think over time, as a science, it is refining very well, and we can start to really make some quite accurate sort of measures of particular things, and we're starting to apply ecological footprinting at various different levels. So, as I say, it began with countries and regions. We've been applying it to events. So taking things like rock concerts, for example, or we did one for the FA Cup final when Wembley was being redeveloped and they had the FA Cup final in Cardiff. We did an ecological footprint for that as an event, looking at the total mass of spectators and effectively calculating how much extra they consumed on a day out at the football compared to staying at home for the day. We measured all sorts of things from the waste generated, and we even worked with the stadium and the local government to work out how much waste was generated by that event. We looked at how much food and drink all the spectators consumed, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, they consumed much more beer and pies and beef burgers than they would have done on a day at home. We looked at the transport decisions of all the different spectators. We did a major survey of the spectators coming into the ground, finding out how far they travelled and how they travelled. And that gave us, ultimately, we could say, well, how much of the planet was consumed by holding the FA Cup final? And when we did that, actually, we got criticism in papers and things saying, well, we're killjoys. We're trying to take the fun out of football by worrying about the ecological footprint of the FA Cup final. But the serious point about it is, if you know where the impacts come from, you can start to manage them. And what we discovered was, for example, the year that we did the footprint calculations, it was Manchester United versus Millwall. And what we discovered was the Manchester United fans were much better at using trains and coaches, partly because they'd been there before, so they knew how the transport system worked. The Millwall fans didn't really know how the trains to Cardiff worked, and so tended to bring their cars instead. So just simply kind of telling those supporters how they could have travelled to the game differently, and maybe organising different transport solutions could have cut the footprint. We discovered the waste was actually very inefficiently collected from the stadium compared to what was possible. And on the basis of the data we generated, the stadium actually created new waste management policies and renegotiated the contract with their waste their waste collectors. So it's often having the information from things like that helps you to improve it. So it's very interesting science, ecological footprinting. But if we do it at a humankind level, and the Global Footprint Network every year publishes what the world's ecological footprint is in terms of how much humankind is using from the planet, and tracking our best kind of knowledge of what the productive capacity of the Earth is, including data from things like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And we can say pretty accurately we know that we're using up more than we should in terms of what's available for us that we could use sustainably. So, as I say, perfect accuracy, we probably aren't there yet, but I think it's pretty indisputable that mankind is now living beyond its environmental means.
Yeah, it seems like a very scientific process, and it seems very involving as well, this whole ecological printing. Well, thank you very much. I have no more questions for this chapter. I think you've really made me understand it. And I hope same goes for you viewers. We would like to thank Professor Ken Peaty for providing answers. So until we see you next time, it's bye for now.